As the GOP and the members of the president's own party vow to scuttle the Iran nuclear deal, how might this D.C. fight with the world implications affect White House race in 2016? And what's the alternative to the president's plan? We'll get some perspective from the Wall Street Journal's Pulitzer Prize-winning foreign affairs columnist and editorial board member, Bret Stephens. He's the author of America in Retreat, The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder. He joins me from New York. Bret, thanks for being with us.
Good to be on your show, Larry.
In a commentary about what you characterize as the collapsing rationale of the Iran nuclear deal, you recently wrote, "The administration believes that it has to destroy a region," meaning the Middle East, "in order to save it." What do you mean?
Well, I was playing on the old line from the Vietnam War that the village had to be destroyed in order to be saved. The administration is saying that in order to prevent a nuclear Iran, we're going to have a deal that is going to effectively make them quite soon a threshold nuclear state. And in the meantime, to allay the concerns of our allies, and I don't just mean the Israelis, but I also mean the Saudis, the UAE, others who are potentially threatened by Iran, we are in the process of arming them to the teeth. The Wall Street Journal had a front-page story just earlier this week making the point that we are now going to provide the Saudis with ballistic missile defenses. We're going to sell them. We're going to sell them more arms. So we are essentially funding and fueling a conventional arms race in the region in order to stave off the possibility, which I think is remote, that Iran, or the possibility which I think is real, that Iran is going to get nuclear weapons. In the meantime, by the way, one more point which is important is if you read carefully through the text of this deal is going to give the Iranians tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of sanctions relief, some portion of which is going to go to groups like Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen or the Assad regime in Damascus or Shiite militias in Iraq. And so for the sake of this deal, we are fomenting an incredible amount of instability and an arms race in the very region we're trying to pacify.
Why has the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese, the English, why have they all supported it?
Well, I think each of them has every country has its reasons. Look, the Russians have never been happy about the efforts to sanction the Iranians. They see Iran as a potentially very good export market, particularly for their weapons like the S-300 surface-to-air missile system, which they'll be selling the Iranians. The Chinese weren't happy because China was a major purchaser of Iranian oil, and sanctions limited the amount of Iranian oil that they could consume. I think the calculations among the Europeans vary. Some of them, like I think the French, have commercial interests in mind. One of the first stories to emerge in the wake of the deal was that Peugeot, the car maker, was very interested in getting back in the Iran game. But I think many of them are, quite frankly, simply taking their cue from the Obama administration. American leadership, whether it's Republican or Democratic, still makes a big difference in terms of where the Europeans wind up following.
So Obama isn't stupid, and he's not anti-American. So what is his point in this deal?
Well, I would say if I were an administration official and I was having a on-background conversation with you, Larry, or other journalists, I guess I'd make 2 points. Number one, for the time being, we are better served trying to kick the Iranian nuclear can 5, 10, 15 years down the road than to confront it now. And the best thing to be said for this deal is that, at least if it's honored, it will limit Iran's current capability to make a nuclear weapon. I think it will eventually actually make their ability to produce nuclear weapons that much easier, but for the time being, it limits it. And so it postpones the crisis. That's one argument. I think the second argument, Larry, is that if you postpone the crisis, you might give some time for positive forces within Iran. Right. The Green movement that was suppressed 6 years ago during that abortive revolution, the moderate forces that are opposed to the theocracy that's been ruling there for 36 years. You might give them some breathing space. You might allow political developments to emerge in Iran that are favorable. That's, I think, the bet the administration is making. I just happen to think it's a heroic bet, and I'm being charitable here.
But you don't want to let Israel run our foreign policy, right?
No, Israel should run its own foreign policy.
Right. And they are adamant about this. What is the alternative to this?
Look, you know, people say, and I think you're going to hear from the president, if you haven't already, that the only alternative to this deal is war. And I think that's false. It's false for a number of reasons. But look, there is, within the realm of diplomacy, Larry, there are two kinds. There's what you might call a diplomacy of concessions, which is that you try to concede a lot and engender a spirit of goodwill, or there's a coercive form of diplomacy. You know, in just 2 years after the sanctions, the serious sanctions were applied at the very beginning of 2012, we had the Iranians in a very weak position. Inflation was close to 70%. The value of their currency had plummeted. You had huge capital flight from Iran, and we still, even then, we weren't squeezing them nearly as hard as we could have. We could have put the Iranians, and still can put the Iranians, to a fundamental choice, which is to say, you can have a functioning economy, or you can have a nuclear program, but you can't have both. Now, what this deal does, and which is why I'm so opposed to it, is it says you're going to get your economy back now, and in a few years' time, you're also going to get your nuclear program. And that's why I think it's a terrible deal. We have to go back to telling the Iranians that they have to make a choice rather than evade it.
But you also think it's highly unlikely that the deal can be stopped. Why?
Well, I think, let me put it to you this way. I think it's highly unlikely that Congress is going to stop this deal in this session. I think there's a strong possibility, Larry, that you're going to get more than 60 Senate votes of disapproval. That is to say, all 54 Republicans, but actually quite a few Democrats who have real reservations beyond just the politics of the thing, real reservations about the soundness of this agreement. And we'll see which Democrats come along, but I suspect it will be at least 7 of them. What I don't think is going to happen is I don't think you're going to get the 14 or 15 Democrats you'll need to override a presidential veto. You're going to need 67 votes there, and that's not going to happen. That being said, if you have 63, 64 senators of both parties voting disapproval of the deal, that lays a political predicate for the next president, whether it's Hillary or Bernie Sanders or Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or whoever, to walk away from this agreement, as the next president should, irrespective of Israeli interests. This is about an American interest, which is preventing the country that's still the world's leading sponsor of terrorism from getting that close to having a fully realized nuclear industrial complex and nuclear capability.
Do you think the Iran deal is going to play a big part in the election campaign?
Yeah, I think foreign policy in general is going to play a big part, not least because assuming that Hillary Clinton is going to be the Democratic standard bearer, and I do so assume, her last big job was Secretary of State. So inevitably, her tenure in that position is going to be a topic. But more broadly, Larry, you know, when I started writing this book, American Retreat, the subtext was the subtitle was The Coming Global Disorder. You know, when I started writing it, it seemed like the world was a fairly placid place. You know, we'd reset relations with Russia. Al-Qaeda was on a path to defeat. We seemed to have Iran contained. Most of the world seemed to think that we were in a placid state after the turbulence after 9/11 and the war in Iraq. I think in the last 2 years it's become clear that the idea that we're approaching a disorderly world has become the fact that we are in a disorderly world. And I think Americans are worried about it. I think they're very, very nervous about it. They don't quite know what the answer to it is, but they sense that something has gone badly wrong, that, you know, our enemies think that they can do what they like, and I think many, and our friends feel they're going to have to do what they must, and that's not a world that favors American security or American prosperity. So I think it's going to be a huge topic in 2016.
touching some other areas. What do you make of the opening to Cuba?
Look, fingers crossed. We will see. I mean, there is a good. Let me put it this way. The embargo policy had not been a successful policy for more than 50 years, and so that's an argument for changing it. The question is, do we go forward from what we have now in a way that's going to create real possibilities for the Cuban people, or are we going to move forward in a way that's simply going to provide the regime, whether it's the Castro regime or whoever succeeds them in the Communist Party, with an additional lease on life? And so, leaving behind what has already been done, what I hope this administration does is keep a focus squarely on the regime's human rights record, its habit of imprisoning political prisoners, making sure that money that goes to Cuba gets in the hands of the Cuban people and not the Cuban government, creating a process whereby Cuba finally moves away from what it has been, which is a 55, 56-year-long dictatorship. If that happens, then I think the opening will be judged as a great move. If it doesn't happen, it's just going to be another lifeline to the Castro brothers.
You are for advocating boycotting the 2018 the World Cup of Soccer. Why?
Because Russia is hosting it. Simple as that. And Russia is under Putin. Russia has become a full-bore dictatorship. They are passing laws banning NGOs. They are currently in possession of sovereign territory belonging to neighboring countries, I should say, not just Ukraine, but also Georgia, also Moldova. They are threatening all of their neighbors. There are allegations, and I underline the word allegations, that there was corruption in terms of the bidding for the 2018 World Cup. That has yet to be proved. But look, from 1936 onwards, we know that dictators enjoy the prestige that international sporting spectacles give them. And we should not give Vladimir Putin that kind of prestige by hosting the Cup there. I don't care if you host it on the Falkland Islands or anywhere else, just not in Russia. And by the way, that goes for Qatar in 2022 as well.
Okay, Brad, let's move to the home front and politics. The GOP presidential field now numbers 16. What do you make of that?
I think it's too many. Look, there are some really good candidates in the mix, and I think to the extent that you do have a number of governors with strong records, you do have some highly articulate senators, former governors, that's good. There are a few clowns in the race that I wish would not be there. There are a few has-beens that also have no business being there, and they seem to be auditioning for a TV show as opposed to being serious candidates for the presidency. So I hope the field narrows very quickly, because otherwise it's going to hurt the party. It's going to hurt whoever becomes the nominee. We haven't discussed the name till now, but the most recent Washington Post ABC News poll has Donald Trump with 24% of support among the Republicans, based on Scott Walker's 13% and Jeb Bush 12%. He's doubling the field. What do you make of this? Well, I think that will fade. I think Mr. Trump, is in the process of self-immolation politically, obviously with the idiotic comments about John McCain's military record. I don't recall Trump being in the Hanoi Hilton in the 1960s and 1970s. I guess I'll have to check my history. But he's a joke candidate who's obviously benefiting from excessive media attention. In many respects, I think the less said about him, the better. I guess I'll only say that some of his positions are so far from what the Republican Party believes, or at least most of the Republican Party believes, especially when it comes to his kind of protectionist worldview, that he really should be he should be vying for the Democratic nomination. His comments about Mexicans his comment about Mexicans was despicable and stupid, and I think that every other Republican should be doing their utmost to distance themselves from him and shame on those who aren't.
But since the McCain remarks, the numbers went up. How do you explain that?
Well, in part, I think it's because these polls this early in the race, when most Americans aren't taking such a close look at the field, do more to reflect who's generating the most amount of lightning and thunder, and rather who people are going to find genuinely attractive. Look, I think the real danger with Trump for the Republicans is that he's going to mount a third-party candidacy and draw, say, maybe 5% of the vote, which on the margins could do to Republicans in 2016 what in 2000 Ralph Nader did to Al Gore.
And what Ross Perot did to George Bush.
Yeah, although Ross Perot was a much more serious figure, I have to say, than Donald Trump is.
What about the Republican Party and blacks, Latinos, gays, and women? If you combine all of those, how do they win?
Well, for one thing, I mean, look, you see a guy like Rand Paul. I have deep disagreements with Rand Paul on foreign policy, but it's good to see a Republican like him trying to make steady inroads with the African American community, going and speaking at African American events, and also saying that the GOP has a lot to say about issues that really concern African American voters. The quality of inner city schools, the lack of choice for so many inner city parents who would love to send their kids to a charter school but are prevented from doing so by arbitrary rules from people like Bill de Blasio limiting those schools. Wage rules that make it difficult for especially young teenage or young black men from finding employment. So I think actually Republicans have a lot to say, or could be saying a lot more to the African American community that they find appealing. On to the gay community, look, you know, I am on this subject. I have long been an advocate of gay marriage. I think there's a profound conservative case to be made for gay marriage. I think Republicans, as the party that believes in liberty and the pursuit of happiness, ought to be embracing this movement as its own. In terms of Hispanics, look, you know, George W. Bush won 44% of the Hispanic vote in 2004 because he was a governor who tried to make the party inclusive. And I think that Republicans can't win if they don't repeat that formula, which, among other things, means advocating for genuine and just and reasonable and plausible immigration reform. We're not going to self-deport 12 million hardworking Latin Americans, or they're not going to self-deport. So that's kind of silly. This, again, the Republican Party ought to be a party that, in believing in free markets, also believes in the glory of immigration. We are all immigrants here. And in terms of women, I think that's not really an issue unless you define women's issues as being in favor of abortion rights, or what a segment of women define it as being. I think women are going to vote on the same wide range of topics as men are, and I think the Republicans are not going to have too much of a problem there, except, of course, that Hillary's candidacy will have a kind of a historic quality.
Is Jeb Bush, therefore, as you assess that, the best candidate in view of his views, particularly in immigration?
Well, Jeb Bush, you know, has done some serious thinking about immigration, and I think his instincts are in the right place, which is to say that he believes we need a process that is going to rationalize a broken immigration system rather than to kind of enunciate some ridiculous wish that we are going to somehow move 12 million Latin Americans out of this country. So at least he's in what you might call the reality zone of the immigration debate. I think the same goes for Marco Rubio, a number of other candidates. Very disappointing to hear some of Scott Walker's comments on immigration.
Well said, Bret. We're wonderful having you with us. Look forward to a return trip.
Thank you, Larry, and all the best to you and yours.
Thank you. His latest book, entitled America in Retreat: The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder.